An unexceptional Saturday morning spent in Starbucks. That's what it should have been. Me and my boyfriend Sean were doing what we usually do, drinking coffee and gossiping about the latest stuff going on in our silly small town. It was a hot day, possibly the hottest in a long time, when he appeared. I was first to notice him, a tall figure, marching down our high street, like a one-man funeral procession, adorned with old-fashioned clothes, a dusty old black suit jacket and hat. He sort of had an Amish look to him. You know, a back-in-time look to him. Then he turned his head, as if he sensed me watching. My heart nearly stopped when his drawn-back lips grinned a false smile my way. Those features of his were withered, drained, and taut, like a cancer patient. He had a crow-beak nose, thin and sharp, and his eyes were sunken and drained. Casting a wave my way, he turned and continued on walking. In his wake, the warming rays of the sun turned and ran, being replaced by shrouds of black clouds. Even as it rained heavy, the man's delirious grin never ceased. He smiled at everyone he passed, but they seemed utterly unaware of him or the change in weather. There was something about that jangly skeleton of a man and his polygriped teeth that was deeply upsetting. It was like a primal feeling, really, sort of like instinct. I looked at him and felt dread. Then just as quickly and unannounced as his arrival, he was gone. "What are you looking at?" Sean asked, seeming oblivious to the creepy man I had just seen. "The man? The creepy guy in the old-fashioned clothes?" I told him. But when I looked back outside, it was a roaring hot day, with no sign of rain or the man who brought it with him. "Are you going all Sixth Sense on me? Do you see dead people?" Sean teased, his blue eyes beaming with amusement. "Shut up," I laughed, as I playfully swatted his hand from mine. We returned to our regular routine Saturday, but that strange man lingered in my thoughts, like an ominous black cloud, raining fear and suspicion, drowning all other thoughts out. In the days that followed, strange things started to happen. Weird weather, pets and animals running off or acting strange, the Reverend seemingly vanishing from the face of the earth. And then there were the deaths. At first, it was just a couple of overdoses. Nothing new. Every town has its druggies and burnouts. But soon, it wasn't just overdoses. It was accidents, odd occurrences, little slips and falls, which caused people to break their necks, shatter their spines, or split their skulls. Maggie, the school cook, even accidentally set herself on fire with a chip pan. Sean's dad was a victim of these so-called accidents. He fell from a ladder, despite Sean holding it steady. When it came time for the funeral, I tried to be there for Sean as best I could, but I knew none of my jokes, nor my loving words, could remedy the injury this sudden and unexpected death had caused. When I was sat beside my boyfriend, I could see he had been swallowed up by grief. His dad was his best friend, the first person to accept him when he came out, and his absolute champion if anyone dared say anything. So that makes what Sean told me all the more strange. You see, before the funeral, Sean had phoned me. He told me that his dad wanted to see him, wanted him to go with him, but I played it off as a dream or grief, or both. I assured Sean that his father would never want him to die too, and that this was going to be difficult, but we could get through it together. Alas, my words hadn't seemed to help. The funeral should have been a lovely service. We should have been able to say goodbye and mourn. However, what happened instead was the abrupt appearance of the last person I expected to see. Accompanying the coffin and officiating was the same creepy man I witnessed walking down the street that day in Starbucks. "Greetings, I am Nathaniel Everett, Reverend Everett. I hope you don't mind, kind people, but my colleague, the Reverend Mills, is not feeling all too well today, and as was passing through, and am an ordained minister, I offered my services," he said in a gentle, southern accent. The words were soft, warm, in the fluent language of the simple townsfolk. They were perfect for pulling people in. They didn't pull me in, though. I saw him, with his out-of-place old-fashioned clothes and his freakish skeletal frame, and knew he was not good. Imposingly tall, he was almost hunched over at the top of his body as he leaned down to preach to us about life and death. My nervous eyes looked on, concerned with this stranger, but no one else seemed to share my anxiety. In fact, this preacher man was welcomed as a stand-in priest, as if that was completely normal and regular. I wanted to say something, sensing that this was odd to say the least, but then that porcelain white, dentured smile of his fell upon me, ushering my lips to silence. Parading around and speaking old parables, the preacher gave a grand performance. With his door-to-door good news-like persona, he offered all salvation, and an insight into the beyond, as if he could ever know such things. He offered us assurances that Sean's father would live on in the afterlife, that he was not finished, and that they too could and would one day meet him again. Open your hearts to those you have lost. Remember them, picture them, hold them in your mind, and they will return to you. He smirked with a sinisterness about him. As soon as the service was over, I wanted to get out of there immediately. But Sean stayed. He wanted a little more time with his father, and I understood. I told him I'd meet him back at his house, where the rest of the attendees were going to drink and eat and celebrate the life of Sean's dad. He assured me he would follow soon after, but never did. As I left the church, I turned back for a moment and saw the preacher lay a hand upon Sean's shoulder and smiled my way. I should have known what that smile meant, but I didn't. I was foolish and afraid. Time passed and it grew dark. With no sign of Sean returning home, his mother, Alice, asked if I had seen Sean, which I answered no, not since the church. Concerned for his well-being, I returned there, fueled by love, not bravery. I powered up the hilltop, past the gravestones and markers, but stopped for a second, halted by fear once more. Before I even stepped foot in the building, there was this sense of foreboding. Standing atop the hill, a small whitewashed structure that I had been baptized in appeared gloomy and dim. Its spire-like bell tower, invaded by flocks of crows, and its windows were darkened, not at all welcoming. Swallowing my fear inside, I marched on. I tried to open the church doors, and to my surprise they were not locked up. This was odd. Reverend Mills always made sure the doors were locked, unless he hadn't told the new preacher to do so. Creaking open, I turned on my phone and shone its light ahead. That's where I found him, hanging from one of the rafters, his tie knotted around a rope. I was devastated. All those plans we had, all those imagined weddings, children, and white picket fences, all evaporated in that one moment. Now all there was an empty seat opposite me in Starbucks. The coroner ruled it as a suicide, and at first I believed the same. Sean was distraught over his father's death. He had blamed himself, so suicide made sense. Thing is, though, my story doesn't end there. It would be better if it did, but it doesn't. One night, I was particularly upset, looking through old photos of us together, remembering his smile, his jokes, and the way he'd ruffle my hair and mess it up, just because it made him laugh to see me fretting. I longed to run my fingers through his short, fiery red hair once more, and begged God to give him back to me. Of course he didn't, so I sat in my sorrow, wishing and wishing, and just as tears were ready to fall from my eyes, I heard it. Thump, thump, thump. I jumped up from my bed with fright. It was nearly midnight. Why would someone be knocking at my door at this time? I thought to myself. Thump, thump, thump. The knocks came again, this time quicker and more urgent. Throwing my duvet from me, I scrambled downstairs to the door. My parents were sound asleep. My father snoring so loudly, it drowned out all other ambient sounds. So you know, if it were a murderer or burglar, politely announcing their arrival, I'd be done for. Peeling back the wooden barrier, I looked out through the screen door and fell back. Words cannot leave my lips. In fact, it was like the air had been stripped from my lungs. Before me, behind the transparent netting, was Sean. He looked exactly the same as he had on the day of his death. The same clothes and the same waxed up hairstyle, only he was translucent, a sort of white with a neon turquoise tint to him. "I've missed you," he exclaimed, as though it was nothing strange about this reunion. I didn't speak. I didn't know what to do. He was there, in front of me, my boyfriend, the same guy who would jab ice cream on my nose whenever we got cones from the parlor down the road, yet he was still dead. How is this possible? You were dead, I yelped, my eyes fixed upon the ligature bruise that wrapped itself around his neck like the coils of a python. I was, and now I'm back. Sean spoke, his voice haunted and rattling. Not at all how I remembered it to sound. Part of me wanted to pull that screen door off its hinges and embrace that boy who would spend hours in my backyard, stargazing with me. However, when my hand reached for the handle of the door, I stopped it. This, no matter how nice it was, no matter how lovely it would be to believe, this was not right. I had wished for his return, that much is true, but I sensed God had no hand in my boyfriend's resurrection. I knew it, in my core. People don't come back, and if they did, I doubt they'd come back just for a friendly chat. "Why have you come here?" I asked, my voice trembling with every word. "For you. I want you to join me." Sean smiled, as though he were offering to take me out somewhere nice. Blood ran from my face, whilst my head spun with confusion and fear. "But you're dead. You want me to kill myself?" I snapped in a hushed tone, trying not to wake my parents. "It's not so bad. Like going to sleep early. Aren't you tired? Aren't you lonely? Don't you ache as I ache? Come join me. Be with me," Sean whispered, his words hissing like a snake, rearing to strike. I missed him, and I ached that much. But life, my life, is mine, and that instinctive urge to push on and survive kicked in. "What are you saying?" I yelled, my voice startling his composed pale complexion. "You could make a rope with your bed sheets, or turn on the gas and go to sleep. There's pills in the medicine cabinet, bleach in the cupboard beneath the sink, or there's always the good old-fashioned hot bath and some blades. You could put our song on, light some candles, and just drift away into my arms," Sean suggested. I went to speak, but I didn't know what to say. I was confused, my head spinning, and my heart drowning in woe. Why would my boyfriend ask me to kill myself? That wasn't him. He would never. He would want me to be happy, to go on. "Don't you want to join me? Don't you love me? If you love me, you'd do it," Sean snapped, his voice more urgent than before. "If you loved me, you wouldn't ask this. In fact, if you were Sean, the Sean I knew, you wouldn't ever want me to end my life," I shouted back, my fearful voice ripping from me in a defiant retort. This did not please him, and his face became a scare, a tortured image of bug-eat flesh, and he let loose his wraith screech before suddenly composing himself and returning to the image of the Sean I buried. "He's going to take you, you know. He'll take everyone in this stupid little town, and when he does, I won't be waiting for you. Do it now. Join me now. And through him, we shall live again, forever," Sean Spector declared, as though he was selling a used car rather than suicide. "Whatever you are, whatever emotional tie brought you here, consider it served. I won't be joining you. Not ever," I cried, slammed the door shut. The sound was loud enough to wake my parents up, who frantically called out, wondering what was going on, but I didn't hear them, for all I could hear was Sean. "I see you're still not ready. Perhaps in time you'll change your mind," Sean said, his voice penetrating the wood of my door. Looking through the peephole, I watched as he wandered into the road, turning to wave goodbye before vanishing into the wind. Sean didn't visit me again, but peculiar things began to happen elsewhere in town. For one, all that summer sun was swallowed but by a constant dreary overcast veil. Rain like we've never had it before blanketed the town, drowning it in icy cold misery, a good reflection of the mood of those who remained behind. The only time it didn't rain was at night, which was strange looking back. Perhaps I should have known then what was happening in my town. Adding to the bizarre weather was the unexpected decline of life. Machinery maiming people, folks passing in the street keeling over. Even mean old man Wilkes, who by everyone's account was the hardiest coffin dodger in the world, was found dead in his yard, having had an accident with a lawnmower. It didn't end there either. A couple of girls in school made the loyal obituaries as well, after taking part in some horrific suicide pact, which in turn seemed to lead their parents to do the same. We were reeling as a town, but things were happening so quickly. Swiftly, my small town shrunk and shrunk, shrinking so fast, in fact, that the news wasn't even quick enough to report it, and when it did, most of the deaths were being signed off as related to this pandemic. Speaking of the pandemic, things only got worse during lockdown. The suicides and deaths rocketed. People were blaming the isolation, refusing to wear masks or social distance, effectively becoming infected and dying. I feared that soon I'd be the last man alive in my silly little town, where previously nothing bad had ever happened. Everyone's tempers flared, with people blaming the government, China, 5G, or protesters. But I swear it was that strange preacher who came to town. My concerns only intensified after the death of Mr. Taylor, the ice cream man. I was walking along the street when I saw him cross the road. Out of nowhere, a car, not properly parked, rolled down the steep hill and crashed into him. It was horrendous, and people were quick to gather around. Standing among the observers of the incident was that strange preacher. You might be thinking, why did I suspect him? There were other observers there too. That is true, but he was the only one smirking at the grisly sign. Then there was Peter Boucher, a rather vocal man who disapproved of the stranger's preachings, calling them blasphemous. The following day, he was found, cold and blue, his eyes glassy and dead. A heart attack, apparently. I tried to check the news to see if anyone was reporting this phenomena outside of our town, if anyone had noticed, but they hadn't. It was odd. It was as if someone was making sure the information didn't get out. The days that followed saw us return to the church again, our congregation shrinking radically. One time in particular stands out. We were there to bury Sean's mother. I guess Sean came to her with the same offer, only unlike me, she accepted it. As I sat in the church with my parents at either side of me, I looked at the grinning man, who appeared to have completely usurped the reverend's position. The dead are not gone. They live with us. They will always be there. You just have to welcome them. Let them in. Let death not be the end. God does not want it to be so. If you want to join them, you join them. If you want to stay, you stay. Is that not the absolute definition of free will? We are not to judge Alice, a mother and widow, who felt she could no longer go on without her husband and son. The preacher spoke, his words bordering on heretical. To my horror, people began crying out amen and clapping frantically. The church was almost entirely under his sway. Their glazed over looks and empty, emotionally drained vessels were just flocking to him. "This is wrong," I spoke out, causing everyone in the church to gasp. The preacher's face widened with amusement and unnerved me back to silence. "Now let the boy speak," the preacher exclaimed, eager to hear my words. "God doesn't want you to die. He doesn't want you to kill yourselves. Nor would our loved ones," I declared, trying to counter his vile teachings. "I never said such things. That's your interpretation. All I said was if a person chose to leave us, that we should not judge. If a person wants to leave, they should feel welcome to do so, he exclaimed, and the room clapped. Disgusted and horrified, I fled from the church, seeking refuge by Sean's grave. I sat there for hours, sat there until the service ended and Sean's mother was laid to rest beside him. Still, I didn't leave. I missed Sean. If he was here, the real him and not that spectral version, he would believe me. He would know what to do. I must have gotten lost in thought. Either that or the days were growing short, for I suddenly found myself sitting in the darkness of night. The only source of light was the flickering glow emanating from the glass eyes of the church. I heard what sounded like weeping and hushed, but still audible talking, coming from the chapel. It was the Abernathys, both Mr. and Mrs. Abernathy, and their 3 kids. Mrs. Abernathy had recently been diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer, and the whole thing had taken its toll on them, so seeing them in church, possibly seeking guidance or prayer, wouldn't be odd. However, they were not seeking either of those things. Instead, they were sat, kneeling in a circle, with empty bottles of booze and pills. They were smiling, crying, and looking up at the preacher, who circled them like a hungry shark. Flickering lights from candles in the room caught his face, and for a moment, a split second, a glimpse what he was. A charade of a man, something devoid of the essence of life, something inhuman. His corpsely head creaked as it twisted round to the window, his maggot white face meeting mine. Then he raised a bony finger, each joint in the limb cracking, as he motioned it up in front of his lips and ushered a whistling hush. Falling back from the window, I fled from the man and his ghastly grin. I never told anyone what I had seen, worried that their warped loyalty to him would turn them on me should I speak out. However, the following day, when Abernathys were discovered in their home, dead from an overdose, I found I could not stay silent. Still, my pleas and worries fell on deaf ears. Even the sheriff, a longtime friend of my father's, did not take my complaint seriously, saying that with everything going on, he didn't have the time to chase rumors or suspicions. Defeated and feeling more alone than ever, I returned to my home, and to utter horror, found the garbage spewing out choking fumes. I tried to open it but couldn't, so I called the sheriff. He and a couple of the neighbors ripped the door up and revealed my father. He had suffocated himself. A hose was attached to the exhaust and pushed through the window of his car. By his side was a bunch of overdue bills, which he had obviously been keeping a secret from us, and a letter which spoke about joining his father who had died many years ago. Even the sheriff was not immune to the fatal phenomena occurring across this town, for shortly after retrieving my father, they found his car careened off the road, after having sent a text to his daughter saying he's sorry about her mother. I couldn't fathom what was happening. I knew it was the preacher man. I knew he wasn't human, but I had no way to stop him or get help. Do you know what that feels like? That utter, isolating powerlessness? To know no way of escaping or fighting back? To know nothing protected you, and any false move would spell your end. That was what I felt. On the final night of this saga, my mother, newly widowed and drinking heavily, and I could count on my hands the amount of people still left in the town. That night was different to the others, for around midnight, the street became illuminated not by lampposts, but by the spectral white forms of all those who had died. Not just recently either. Every long dead family member, all those the town had forgotten from its history, rose and walked once more. Puritans, natives, and Confederate soldiers, peasants, drowned witches, and many others, all wandered the roads. This mortuary parade made its way through the town and its streets, with the dead knocking upon each and every door, tempting others to join them. Some did, their spirits emerging from their homes moments later and joining the legions of deceased. That's when I noticed it. My mother's whimpering had stopped, her drunken sobbing silenced completely. My gut sank, and I knew what she had done. Before I even opened the bathroom door and found her body in the tub, her spirit rose from its watery grave, passing through me, and as she made her way downstairs and through the front door into the street, I saw them. My parents, Sean, all the taken were there in the parade, and out of desperation, rather than bravery, I rushed out after them. He was there, the preacher. Charging out into the street, I confronted him. He was humming a tune and waving an old-fashioned sickle, as though he was a conductor of a musical orchestra. Then he turned that wicked man and strolled alongside his ghostly forces, making his way towards me with great eagerness. Gone was his human disguise, and my heart thumped and damn near stopped when I saw him. Whatever fiendish horror he was, he now proudly announced it. More than withered and gaunt, his face was a ghoulish sight. His bald head and a skull wrapped in mummified flesh, ashen and pallid color. Gone were his eyes. They were now replaced by empty sockets, a pair of abyssal holes bored into his head. His nose was a gash, no more a beak, but rather a triangular tear. I looked at his face, watching as bits flaked off and floated into the air around him. The skin of his face still bulged with protruding bones, pushing behind his withered porcelain flesh. One thing remained unchanged. His smile, now entirely lipless, was fixed in a garish, grim grin. "Ah, come to join us, have you? There's always a place with us. All are welcome," he said with his gentlemanly patter and preachy southern charm, trying to worm its way into my mind. "I want you to," I stammered, trying to get the words out, now that I was stood face to hideous face with the truth of that man. "I want you to bring them back," I spat, finally releasing the words that had been locked by fear. "Back? As a rule, I don't bring the dead back. For you, though, I might make an exception. But in return, I want you," he sneered, his bones creaking and cracking as he did. "Me?" I gasped, shocked by his proposal. "You've resisted. Your determination, your strive for existence is strong. Imagine how hot my fires would burn if all that will of yours was poured into my ranks," he said as he approached me, looming over me with his skeletal shape. Who are you?" I whimpered, my words inching forward as I inched back, step by careful step. "Why, child, don't you know?" grinned the preacher. "You've read the stories, heard my name in the wailing of widows and the ache of lost love. I was there at your birth, a shadow, always near." I hesitated, stopping where I stood. I looked at his hideous form and felt all courage and will siphon out from me and into him. I knew now who he was and that truth. That solitary realization filled me with a type of absolute terrible dread. I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name, I recited, only to halt at the last word, too afraid to acknowledge it. "Death," the preacher interjected. Lightning flashed, and for a second, the man's already frightening face was unmasked further, unveiling a towering shrouded vestige, the antithesis to life. "I am the Pale Rider, the Reaper, and the Boatman. I am the most grim, the cold bite of winter, and the shine of the executioner's axe. I am wither, decay in the twilight. Many names and titles, too many to recount, but for now, my necronomic majesty is content to be referred to as Death," he declared, even going as far to bow his own head. As though it were a formal introduction, shadows stretched out from him, and the night itself became eclipsed. The air in my lungs froze solid, and my heart couldn't beat any faster. I stumbled back, afraid and terrified of the freezing presence of his dark intentions enveloped me. "Give yourself to me, child. Take my hand and walk with me," Death beckoned. "If you're Death, then why not just take me? You did it to the others," I questioned, continued to edge away from the figure as he crept closer. Because there's rules, there's a balance, for now at least, grinned the Grim Reaper. Why not just make something happen? An accident, like you did with Sean's dad. I spoke, my words wobbling with worry and apprehension at his reply. You want parlor tricks? I can nudge a car in the right direction, summon the wind to knock you off your balance. But where would be the artistry in that? I prefer the subtle approach, the sweet satisfaction of total domination over another's will, he hissed. But there's something else, isn't there? You can't do that. My soul won't go if you do it that way. That's why you haven't, I retorted. Finally the penny had dropped. For a moment, that grin diminished upon the preacher's face. As I said, there are rules that bind my hands. Some of you are more vulnerable to my touch. For instance, your town's sheriff, and his desire to escape the guilt of murdering his wife. That allowed me to brush him aside, as if he were dust on my shoulder. Your father with his secret debt weighing heavy on his soul, and your mother's newly widowed status were all I needed to whisper to them, to reach out and touch their minds. Others, however, like yourself, can resist my influence. For now, he admitted, his tone annoyed and bitter. So you're too weak, I said, suddenly imbued with a false sense of confidence. I am nothing of the sort, he bellowed, his voice causing thunder to rumble through the clouds above. I'm not at my full strength, that much is true, but I can still summon a storm and shroud the sun, and when I am, return to my full potential, I will be able to stride across the lands. I'll be able to snuff out anyone and everyone I choose, like blowing out a candle. Alas, I am a little rusty, a bit groggy. You see, my brothers and I have just awoken. I sense they too are about, and having their own fun. Brothers? I anxiously asked. Oh yes, the others. They are here. The seals have been broken. The end has come, my sweet, simple Simeon. You should just give up now, before the real show kicks off, he suggested, his words luring like the luminous bulb of an anglerfish. I found my feet drawn closer to him, my head swimming with fears and doubts, with desire for everything to just stop, to rest. But then I stopped myself, pulling away and edging back. No, I gasped. No? You would deny me? He smirked, amused by my impertinence. Come now, aren't you tired? You fought so hard and you've done brilliantly. Why not give in now? Be united with those you loved and lost. He preached, selling his utopia vision of deathless sleep. His words tugged and pulled, reminding of childhood memories. They summoned images to my mind's eye of mine and Sean's first kiss. It was cruel, it was intoxicating, but it was effective. I found myself drifting into that sea of pleasantries and wonderful sights, drowning in my longing and deepest wishes. Come, be with us, the preacher whispered, his voice now disappearing and being replaced by those of Sean and my parents. No, I snapped, only waking up just in time to recoil my hand, which was frighteningly close to his. You said it yourself. You're not strong enough to take me by force, I snapped. True, but after a couple towns have fallen, given themselves to my service, I will be able to raise more than a few ghosts. My reach will extend from one end of the globe to the other, and all within it shall feel my touch. Now come with me, he ordered. No, you're still not getting me, I said as I backed up, afraid, but relentlessly gripping hold of the only thing I had left. What if I sweetened the pot and offered you and the one you loved freedom from my service, after the time of tribulation, of course? The preacher proposed, bidding on my life as though I was an eBay listing. The answer would still be no, I returned. Fine, final offer now. I could bring you back your parents, reunite you with your lost love, and free you not only from my service, but return you all back to life, after your contract to me has ended, he bartered, almost begging me to take his hand. Now I saw him for what he was. He wasn't just the Reaper. He was a salesman. This was his last pitch. And though death may promise all, I knew it would deliver nothing. His words were as hollow as his eyes and as empty as his heart. Never. You can't have me or my life. I won't be joining you. I trembled on my words, worried what his next reaction would be. I was right to fear him. Never? Never? I am not some door-to-door salesman boy, he roared, his form shattering like smoke as a great giant's apparition appeared in his place. I am death. None can resist me, nor ignore my call. Join me now, or I will visit upon you, haunts and terrors the likes of which no one has seen before. I will drag you to the void beyond, and let you gaze into the godless maw until your mind unravels. I will make you suffer, make you hurt, make you wish your life away, but wouldn't you rather peace than all that suffering? I offer you everything, your lost love, another life, and peace eternal. What is your answer? Boom, specter of dread and decay. Frightened, I fell back, crawling along the ground as grand skeletal form, with its grim hood and scythe loomed over me. I said no, I yelled out. Then suddenly the dire visage of the Grim Reaper dispersed, reforming before me as the skeletal and mummified preacher. Damn, I really wanted you. Oh well, shame, but I suppose you'll come to me eventually. All of you come to me in the end. And if I am anything, I am patient. He smiled, tipped his hat, and turned away from me. Wait, bring them back. Please bring them back. I begged as I fell to my knees. Ignoring my pleas, he and his ghostly flock marched on. That's when it appeared, a steed, ghostly and silent, made of ethereal wisps and webs of white spiritual threads. It swirled up from beneath death, who sat upon it and became the image that all good Christians know to dread. He was death, decay, and destruction incarnate, unflinching and merciless. He offered nothing and took everything, and now he walked amongst us. Atop his pale horse, the rider and his legions of ghostly specters rode up into the night sky, onward to sell their grave reunions and promises to others. That is why I wrote this, to warn the world. Pandemic and all the other misery we're seeing, it's nothing. Nothing compared to what comes next. Check your town's death rates, monitor the suicides, and if a strange preacher comes to visit, if death seems to follow in his wake, then whatever you do, you must resist. Resist with all your might. Listen not to those he sends to collect you. They are not the ones you loved, not anymore. They are his now, succumbed to his grim influence, enthralled and bound for eternity. He can't take us all, not yet, but it's only a matter of time. So this is important. This is why you must remember, if you feel desperate, if you feel alone or you're missing a loved one, do not give in to death's siren call. Life is all, and he will stop at nothing to claim it.